I mean, Jeremy Corbyn used to be called the Foreign Secretary of the Left before he was leader, because of his interest in international affairs and his defence of the Palestinians, the Kurds. He's an expert on. Well, I mean, it's quite funny when you hear there was a press conference or a speech he made in the general election, not the Geneva one. There was a speech he made about foreign affairs in the general election. When afterwards the press asked him lots of hostile countries, and every time they did, he kind of went into this huge lecture about the internal politics of whichever country it was they'd asked him about, and showed that he has, immense knowledge about these things. The trouble is, the reason why it's a flashpoint is because most of his parliamentary party have a completely different conception of politics, and this is really deep-rooted in the Labour Party, where the right of the Labour Party has an Atlanticist view, pro-American view. I mean, it used to be pro-empire when Britain ruled, half the world, pro-NATO, pro-nuclear. And these have become shibboleths for the right of the Labour Party, pro-Israel as well. Really the kind of identity of the right of the Labour Party is not so much forged on domestic policy. Lots of not the Blairites, who are a slightly different species, but lots of the traditional right of the Labour Party, the Tom Watson part of the party, don't really disagree with Corbyn's domestic economic policies at all, because they're social democrats. But they do really sharply and quite violently disagree with his foreign policy, and he's in a minority, especially in the parliamentary party, as we've just seen this week, where he's been standing up and saying something, and then he's been getting more attacks from behind him than he has from the Tories across the House. So that's the reason why it's such a flashpoint. It's not that he doesn't know what he's talking about, it's that it's just a fault line in the Labour Party, basically. But the one thing we saw in the general election was, after the Manchester attack, this is one of the key moments, when the Manchester attack happened, the Tories wanted to suspend campaigning for a kind of 7 days, long time, which was obviously to the disadvantage of the Labour Party. And they decided, it was actually Seamus Milne who decided, that Corbyn would do a speech on terrorism and security on the Friday after the attack, 4 days after the attack. And this was like a really big call, and people were phoning up his staff saying, if he does this, we're finished, Labour's, the election's over. They couldn't find a Labour MP to introduce him for that speech. Nobody was willing to put themselves, to associate themselves with this speech. When it was pre-briefed the night before, the press predictably ran with headlines saying Corbyn says Britain's to blame for terror, etc. And the journalists, you could see that the media commentators thought that this was the big slip-up, this was the big chance where they were going to get Corbyn. And then he gave the speech, and it was much more reasonable than people had predicted. He just said, effectively, he said jihadis are responsible for their own actions, but if you go into a region of the world and wreck it and create the ideal conditions for jihadism to grow, you're not doing yourself any favours. That was basically the argument of his speech, which was the same argument as many people from the security services have made. And this was still dismissed as beyond the pale. You had all the Tories coming out saying he's making excuses for terrorism, it's appalling, it's disgraceful, all the press piling in. And then there was a YouGov poll, an instant YouGov poll, which showed that an absolute majority of the public agreed with Corbyn's speech, 54% against 20-something which disagreed. A massive result in favour of what Corbyn has said. And that really kind of shifted perceptions and turned things on its head. And so I think that in certain circumstances, especially when it comes to foreign intervention, it is actually an advantage, but he has to communicate that to the public over this incredibly hostile party and media on these topics.